Welcome back to News Talk. We're joined now by a man who has just written an extensive new book about this place, about the nation's capital. It is called, appropriately enough, Washington, A History of Our National City. There it is. The author, he's here in the studio, Tom Lewis, Professor Emeritus of English at Skidmore College, retiring from my mother's alma mater after 47 years. So congratulations on that, and congratulations on this. There have been a lot of books about Washington. What angle, what approach did you take? It's really extensive. How did you approach this?
Well, I focused on three things, I think, and one is the lack of civic governance in Washington, which I think is a huge problem. The racial profile of the city's past, which informs its racial profile today, I think. And then the fact that Washington is a symbol of the country, and it should be regarded as that way, and unfortunately it's not regarded as such, and that's a great problem, I think, because the subtitle of this book is Washington, A History of Our National City, and I really meant it that way. It's our city. It belongs to me in Saratoga Springs, New York, or the person in Oregon or Maine or Texas, but unfortunately it's become a four-letter word, if you will, for all that's wrong with the politics and with the country, and it's always been that way, and that's a shame.
Which is, I've always thought it's kind of odd, it's kind of funny that dynamic has evolved, because whatever Washington is, it's that way because of the people who've come here from every other corner of the nation, not from the people who are born here and reside here and are going about their normal lives here. If you don't like the country, at some level, I mean, if you don't like Washington, at some level, it's because you don't like the nation, because that's who's here, causing all this problem.
Exactly. I think it goes back to the fact that Washington, the city, was born in a compromise, and the North wanted it in New York or Philadelphia, and the South didn't, and ultimately they compromised on the Potomac River, and they allowed George Washington to set the place. It wasn't specifically said in 1790 that it would be where it presently is. They allowed George Washington to make that decision.
Fair to call it not an obvious site?
I think he wanted it close to Mount Vernon, and he got it.
And water.
And water, yes. Well, it's going to always be on the Potomac. And he actually brought it in to the Anacostia River and across the Anacostia River, and it was a 10-mile square. It was a diamond. Don't forget that Washington lost about a third of its territory in Virginia in 1846 in retrocession, which was another, I think, a great shame for the city.
You talk about Washington apartheid. What do you mean by that?
I think that Woodrow Wilson was really the worst president for the city of Washington. He instituted racism and created what I called the apartheid situation in Washington. He instituted basically segregation in all the federal departments. He did it in, he would like to think, a benign way. I think ultimately it was a malevolent way. And the effects of that have redounded right down to the present day.
Interesting to see history look anew at Wilson and his policies. There are, and as it happens, there are protests as we speak in Princeton and beyond.
Absolutely. I should say I'm a Woodrow Wilson scholar. As a matter of fact, I have a Woodrow Wilson fellowship in my past. But I came to really dislike Wilson over the course of writing this book. And it's a curious thing. Washington was not Wilson's favorite city by any stretch of the imagination. He never said one thing about Washington, D.C. in the State of the Union message. He never mentioned the city. He disliked the city, and yet the great irony is he's buried in the city. The only former president is Woodrow Wilson, to be buried in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral.
You write extensively about the demographic and economic ebb and flow of the nation's capital.
I do. I think that's very, very important. It's Washington. We have to understand that the federal government created this federal district, but they didn't fund it with any money at the beginning to build the city. And that led to the worst sorts of land schemes, scams imaginable. They even, and this is typical of this country, they even created a lottery at one point to fund the erection of public buildings. It got precisely nowhere. And that really set the stage for what's happened in over the 2 centuries. And after the Second World War, if I can jump to that for a moment, Washington wasn't able to extend its boundaries as so many cities had done in the early 20th century. They could not do that. So they'd lost a good deal, a third of the city in retrocession in 1846. But they couldn't move, say, into Montgomery County or Prince George's County, and that was, to me, a very great shame. We have to understand, remember, as every Washingtonian does, that Washington is larger in population than 2 of the states of the Union now. At times, it's been larger than 8 of the states in the Union. Right now, it's larger than Wyoming and Vermont. And yet we have in this city no senator, no congressperson. And that's a terrible thing. No voting congressperson.
Unique among nations, virtually.
Absolutely.
How would you explain that to a tourist from another nation on the Mall or the proverbial Martian?
Well, I think you can't explain it. Here we are at the heart of the American democracy.
Is race ultimately?
Absolutely. And Washington, Congress has always treated Washington as the stepchild of the democracy. And it's, of course, a great anomaly that we have in Washington, D.C., no real power to determine the future of the citizenry.
When you consider the very founding of this nation, separate from the capital, of course, the energy, where the energy and the passion to break from England came from to end up in this situation today is beyond bizarre. You're back in town in February. I hope you'll join us then.
Yes, I will.
The book is called Washington, A History of Our National City. The author, Tom Lewis. Thank you so much. We'll talk with you again.
Great to be here.
Great to have you here. We're back with a program note after this.